So let me just start out by trying to explain how the topic of this colloquium was chosen. This is the last year in the 20th century. It's 1999, and certainly for the world, it has been an extraordinary century. I don't think as many things have changed in one century before the 20th century. And for the Jewish people, it has been a century of transformation. In this century, we have been transformed. I mean, there have been incredible events, from the Holocaust to the establishment of the State of Israel, to the emergence of the United States of America as the largest Jewish community in the world. I mean, all these incredible changes that have taken place. And in the process, the Jews of the world have been altered, and what we're now facing is the consequence of that. The consequence of that is that we have in the world something that you can call a Yehudi Chadash. Whether he or she is aware of it or not, that means a new Jew. That is, the lifestyle of the overwhelming majority of the Jews of the world today is radically different from what it was 100 or 200 years ago. There is a radical discontinuity between who we were and what we are. And coping with that radical discontinuity has been the great problem for Jews in the 20th century. And there have been three alternatives. One is to reject what we have become and to go back to what was. And certainly today in the Jewish world, both in North America and in Israel, all over the Jewish world, we see what's happening. The second is called the holding operation. The holding operation is somehow to say, wouldn't it be nice if we could do all of the old, but we can't anymore. So we'll do as much of it as we can. And in fact, a high percentage of the Jews of the world are indeed in movements that express the holding operation. But at the beginning of the 20th century, there appeared certain radical movements. They said, if we have a new Jew, we need a new kind of Jewish identity, not separated from the past, rooted in the history and culture of the Jewish people, but not the slave of tradition. And so there arose the idea, very self-consciously, of the new Jew, the Yehudi Chadash. And in fact, if you look at many of the movements at the beginning of the 20th century, that's where they were. They were radical movements. The Reform movement at the beginning of the 20th century, the Zionist movement, the Yiddishist movements, and later on in the century, the Jewish feminist movements, whatever it be. They were trying, in a sense, to redefine the character and nature of Jewish identity. Therefore, we called this colloquium Beyond Tradition, meaning not that we reject or repudiate tradition, we use it. But the kind of Jew that we have to be in order to have integrity goes beyond tradition, and now there is the struggle for creating the new identity. Well, at the end of the 20th century, what we find is that a lot of the fire of the original concepts is gone. And now we're living in a world where we talk all the time about the return to tradition. And now we are in a world in which movements are turning around. The secular state of Israel is now what? Turning around. The Reform movement, well, they just had a resolution by the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Maybe we ought to return to halakha, to the old traditional way. And so that raises the issue. What happened to the old fire? Maybe the only way to guarantee Jewish survival is indeed to return. And if that's true, then what we have all been trying to do doesn't make any sense. So this colloquium is going to deal with that issue. It has, three basic questions. What were these original visions? What went wrong? And if indeed we believe that the only way with integrity to deal with the new Jew is indeed to struggle to create a new Jewish identity out of the material of the past, but also with the present, what do we do? So those are the defining questions of this colloquium, and to begin the discussion, we have invited to be our keynote speaker somebody whom I have long admired. First of all, it isn't often that we find a speaker whose home is the Detroit area. Ze'ev Chafets was born and raised in what has now become suburban Detroit, but wasn't, I think, when he was born. It's called Pontiac, Michigan. So this whole area is familiar to him. At the age of 20, having been the president of the National Reform Youth Group called NIFTY, and some of you in this room may have been members of that organization, he went to Israel. And there he ultimately became the head of the press office for the Likud government of Menachem Begin, but being a man of conscience, when the terrible massacres occurred in Sabra and Shatila, he resigned from the government and became a very important voice for what I call a secular Israel. In fact, he became one of the founders and editors of the Jerusalem Report, and now remains a very important columnist there. So I always look for Ze'ev's column. It's always wonderful, direct, powerful, significant. Along the way, he became a very successful writer, and many of his books have received nomination for awards, and 2 of them have been acknowledged by the New York Times as being very, 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 very significant. One of them he wrote not on a Jewish issue. He wrote it on Detroit. I think it was about 10 years ago. And it's called Devil's Night. And it was a powerful survey of what was going on in the city of Detroit. It told the truth, and many people got angry, but then it's his thing to tell the truth. So we gave him the question. And what I knew would happen would be, I'm not quite sure what he's going to say, but I know that whatever he says will be clear, direct, powerful, and pulling no punches, and it's with great pleasure that I present to you Ze'ev Chafets.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Wein. I have spoken in the Detroit area from time to time, and there may perhaps be somebody here who's heard me speak before. Is that possible? Is there anybody? So you have heard me talk about the days in which I worked for Menachem Begin, and he, for one brief year, was both Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Israel. Mr. Begin was a thoroughly civilian man who always wore a suit and a tie. He was a very sort of bourgeois Polish look. And, but he had a boyish admiration for Israeli macho figures, particularly generals. And on Thursdays, he would go in his capacity as defense minister down to Tel Aviv to meet with the general staff. And we would see him in the morning getting ready to leave, and he would be wearing his suit and his tie. But as he approached the general staff of the army, he would open up his tie and he would open a button or two and get a little chest hair going. And the people on his staff referred to that as his Clint Eastwood look. Actually, I was the person on his staff. But I tell you this, it has absolutely nothing to do with anything. Just to get my tie off. I also have a story which I want to tell you that relates to Mrs. Aloni, to Shulamit Aloni. It's a story about a man who was in the Johnstown flood. Do you know this story? And he made his living after the flood by lecturing about the Johnstown flood and his experiences in the flood. And this man died, and I know this is incorrect to say here, but he went to heaven. And when he got there, he was told that in order to remain in heaven, there was an audition, and each person on earth, each person there had to talk about something he had done on earth. And so the man said, well, in that case, I think I'm going to give a lecture about my experiences in the Johnstown flood. And God said to him, well, that's okay, but just keep in mind that Noah will be in the audience. And so it is with some humility that I talk about this subject, both in the presence of Rabbi Wein, who was, when I was young, I believe the assistant rabbi at Temple Bethel, and has had such a distinguished career in this area and in world Jewry, and the distinguished members of this panel, and especially Mrs. Aloni, with whom I have not always agreed, but who has done more than almost anyone that I can think of in this generation to make Israel the kind of country that it is on its way to becoming, I hope, and I hope will someday become. Now, when I was invited to come here, I got a letter from Sherwin that said, well, I wrote to him and I said, what am I supposed to talk about? And he sent me back this email, which I will quote to you. It was a private email, but I don't think he'll mind. It said, whatever happened to the bold message of Jewish nationalists and reformers who sought to find a new, intense way to be Jewish, beyond halakha and beyond tradition? The salvation of the Jews lay in a repudiation of the religious formats of the past. Something new and exciting was required. Now all that is lost, drowned in a sea of nostalgia that is called return to tradition. Reform Judaism is returning to halakha. Zionism is the prisoner of orthodoxy. The past is glorified. The present is demeaned. What happened to cause this dramatic reversal? Where are the bold voices, secular and religious, that did not need to be kosherized by the past, but who recognized the need for courageous innovation? And I read this to my wife, and she said, well, what do they need you for? It's not the first time she's asked me that question, by the way. And let me say one more thing. This is a colloquium. I wasn't even sure what that was when I was invited to it. And in the discussion before we came in here, the members of the panel or of the group were discussing not revisionism. They were discussing Reconstructionism, and they were talking about Spinoza. To me, Spinoza is a street in Tel Aviv. I'm not an academic, and I'm not an intellectual, despite the pretensions that I may occasionally have. And I'm not going to present you today with programmatic answers to these very significant questions. I'm sure that the speakers, as you go along in this weekend, will have some very fine ways of approaching this that haven't occurred to me at all. What I do want to do is talk a little bit from my experience, both my personal experience and also the experience I had with writing a book which only 2 or 3 of you have read because only 2 or 3 copies were sold. Which was, you passed them around, right. You want to know about Jewish identity? The name of the book was Members of the Tribe, and it was a trip that I took through the United States and met with various kinds of Jews. So my experiences with American Jews is mostly through that, and with Israeli Jews from the experience of having lived in Israel for the past 35 years. To answer the first of Rabbi Wein's questions in a very simplistic and easy way, the reason that the messages that we have had in the past no longer work, whether it's the Orthodox message or whether it is the labor Zionist message, is because they're no longer relevant. Just as simple as that. I was on television one time not too long ago with Rabbi Porush in Israel, and I suffered from a moment of rare politeness because he told me that the reason, and this of course is something that people have said again and again, it's a staple of the religious argument in Israel, that the reason that we ought to be respectful of rabbinic authority and judgment is because without them, we wouldn't be here today. They brought us here. They're responsible for Judaism lasting for 2,000 years. Their sacrifices, their piety, their orthodoxy, and so forth are what enabled me, specifically in this instance, to be there. And he also had the effrontery to say that he was what my grandfather was. And I meant to tell him, and thought better of it, that it may be true that what we now consider ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel are the kind of Jews who enabled us to gather here today at the end of the 20th century, and we may feel affection for them in the same way that human beings feel affection for monkeys. And for the same reason, because they are a less evolved form of what we have become. And there are a lot of people in Israel who are ultra-Orthodox and who view that as a sufficient reason to the fact that they were always what they appear to be today is a sufficient reason. Luckily, the majority of Israelis don't view it that way. I don't agree with Rabbi Wein's premise, nor with something that I read by Mrs. Aloni in the paper before I came here, although I may have just read it in a fragmentary way. But I think that the ultra-Orthodox in Israel are losing the cultural struggle, and badly. I don't think that they have a prayer. Or maybe they do, but that's about it. And in the discussion, I'll be happy to elaborate about why that is and why I would say so. The replacement ideology for the ultra-Orthodoxy of Europe was labor Zionism. And I arrived in Israel at the zenith of labor Zionism in 1967, just after the Six-Day War. Within 6 weeks of the war, I waited to see which side was going to win. If it had gone differently, I would be addressing the National Association of Arab Americans right now. But I got there in 67, and I came from Detroit, and you all remember what the summer of 67 was like in Detroit. The 82nd Airborne was in the streets, and there were riots in the campus in Ann Arbor about Vietnam. And I came to Israel, which was by far the most self-satisfied place I had ever seen, where people hung pictures of generals in their shops, and people sang patriotic songs, and people explained to one another how great and how grand their accomplishments had been, and especially to me because I was innocent and ignorant and interested in becoming what they were. I thought that that was a kind of Jewish authenticity, to become an Israeli. And it was very quickly explained to me by Israelis that I could never actually be a real Israeli. Because that is to say, by real Israeli, they meant Israeli wasps, which were, in those days, white Ashkenazi Sabra paratroopers.
Barbara, I didn't get the last word.
Parachuters? Parachuter?
White Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
What did the P stand for? Paratroopers. Paratroopers.
Paratrooper. But they explained to me that I was good material. The Zionists, the labor Zionists, who were materialists, of course, and to one degree or another, Bolsheviks, viewed human beings in terms of material, and they also viewed groups in terms of national collectives. So Yemenites were fair material. I mean, they were backward, but they smiled and danced and made jewelry, and they were some fairly good. The Romanians were better material because they were bright, but they were all criminals. And the Moroccans were terrible material because they were hot-blooded and they had lots of children and so on. And every national group was characterized with the precision of a chart, a chemistry chart. You could find out what your value was by looking at the Zionist chart of the elements. And my value was extremely high because I was an Amerikai, which means to say that I came from an advanced civilization. I had seen color television with my own eyes. Was able to use a toaster oven and so forth. And the deal was that I would get to be good chomer, good material, and I would produce a generation of outstanding new Jews, that is to say Israelis, and that's what my expectations were. And it was such a dominant belief in those days, and one really had to look around at the accomplishments of the labor Zionists with such a sense of awe that we all accepted it as true. And we did until the 73 war, which was a disaster brought upon us by the establishment, the Israeli establishment, the WASP establishment, if you like. And since then, the politics of Israel have been different, and the way that we have looked at people who had until then had been icons became different. And all of a sudden, after 73, and it was manifest in the 77 election of Menachem Begin, a coalition of outsiders who were not Israelis, who considered themselves primarily to be old Jews, that is to say Jews and not first and foremost Israelis, took power. And by the way, it's just a historical footnote, but Menachem Begin never referred to himself as an Israeli. He always called himself a Jew, or an old Jew. He said old Jew. He said, and an Israeli and a citizen of Israel. And it was an important distinction to him. And it was an important distinction to his voters because his voters, who either the ultra-Orthodox or the Sephardic urban classes and so on, understood that they were excluded from the definition of the new Israeli which was the operative definition in our society up until that time. The problem was that not only did the 73 war discredit to a large extent and also liberate to a large extent discredited the old establishment and liberated the anti-establishmentarians, but in time the whole concept of socialism became discredited in the West. And there isn't much to go back to anymore. The difference between no one has, or virtually no one has, and Mrs. Aloni is a former education minister of Israel, no one really has the aspiration anymore to take human beings and treat them as material to put through a big sabra-making machine and grind them up and have little new Jewish boys and girls come out on the other side. That's an aspiration which has been abandoned by all the parties in Israel. And the best that anyone is hoping for right now is some kind of a modus vivendi between the Israelis and the old Jews, and also trying to keep the rabbinical educational systems from stealing more than we can bear in terms of our own view of citizenship. So that's insofar as Israel is concerned, in a like a 2-minute nutshell. And about America, I want to say just the following thing, and that is that the American scene, as I saw it traveling around the country, and as I've seen it since lecturing, it's become very clear, and I'm sure clearer to you than to me because you live here all the time, that the elements of adhesion which once were counted on just aren't there anymore. There is no more such thing as an ethnic American Jewish community. I went to a synagogue in Brownsville, Texas, where most of the women in the Hadassah group were Mexican. Mexican. And I went to a synagogue in Linden Avenue and Boulevard in Queens, where the entire congregation were African Americans, and they used the Chabad prayer book. And the cantor, whose name was Nathaniel Davis, who had studied with Joseph Malevsky, sang the entire service in gospel. And I went down to a synagogue in Donaldsonville in Louisiana, where there were Cajun Jews. In fact, I was there with the last one who was left. His name is Gaston Hirsch. And they used to pray in French. And I went to an old Boychik synagogue in Meridian, Mississippi, where they all come in their baseball hats and spit tobacco on in the spittoons in the synagogue. And if you go to Brooklyn, you will find Syrian Jews and Yemenite Jews. And if you go to California, you will, and maybe here in Detroit, but I went at the height of the AIDS epidemic to a community to Shar Zahav in California, where a great many of the people there were not born Jews. They were the partners of Jews, or they were converts to Judaism. What I'm trying to say is that the old, we're all from within 50 miles of Minsk, just does not obtain anymore. And the Israel fan club approach also isn't going to work anymore, for the very simple reason that Israel has now become a Western nation with a high GNP, and it doesn't need anybody's help. It certainly doesn't need anybody's contributions and anybody's schnorring and anybody's tears and anybody's, it's not necessary. And anybody who's been to Israel in the last few years knows it's not necessary. And the federations here also know that they can't sell Judaism on the basis of Israel. And the time is very rapidly approaching when you won't be able to sell it on the basis of the Holocaust either. Whatchamacallit, the Rabbi Heyer out there in California has got the West Coast franchise for the Holocaust. And the various, 10 million kvetches served this year, It's not your problem, and it's not your responsibility, and it's also not part of your actual experience. When I say you, I mean you and me. I went to Temple Beth Jacob in Pontiac. I also wasn't in Europe during World War II. But it's a borrowed experience, and you can't sustain a community on borrowed experience. It just doesn't work. And the final thing is that the old taboos here don't apply anymore. And the final taboo, of course, was intermarriage. What the Jewish press in Brooklyn refers to as the hidden Holocaust, or the womb of the Gentile woman is the new Auschwitz, and all this kind of stuff. You laugh, but that paper has 130,000 subscribers. It's the biggest Jewish weekly newspaper in the country. But very clearly, intermarriage is now the norm in the United States and not the exception, other than in the ultra-Orthodox communities in New York and Los Angeles. And even in the Orthodox communities, it's now becoming more and more normal, if not more and more normative. And I think that you have to look at that and ask yourself the following question: is that good or bad? And having myself not long ago married a Cajun Catholic woman from Lafayette, Louisiana, I can say that in my view it is, but I felt this before I married Lisa, and even when I wrote the book in '86, it's a very good thing indeed that intermarriage is a blessing for the American Jewish community, in that it will dilute some of the neuroses which are inherent in 75 years of kvetching and worrying and struggling and worshiping at the shrine of Jewish victimhood. But very clearly, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, it is the thing. And there are lots of congregations in the United States today where when you address an audience like this, Jewish congregations, the majority of the people in the congregation are not Jews, either by birth or sometimes not even by affiliation. But they're simply the spouses of Jews. I was in Texas one time, and I asked a guy who was he was giving me a hard time about why Israel isn't more religious, and he supported the law of, the law of return, strengthening the law of return, and keeping out goyim and so on. And I said to him, what do you do if a guy turns up at your synagogue and he wants to join? And it was a conservative synagogue. He said, well, nothing. We sign him up. And I said, well, you don't ask him if his mother was Jewish? He said, no, we don't do that. You don't ask him if he's Jewish? No. All right, we sign him up. I said, well, what happens if he gets up during services and he said, I don't believe in God? And he said, well, we have a lot of members. who don't necessarily believe in God. And I said to him, well, what happens if he gets up in the service and he says that he believes in Jesus? And he said, well, in that case, we send him to the Reform Temple. Anyway, the point of the story is that the demography of American Jewry is more than any single other thing radically different than Rabbi Wein mentioned the various changes that have taken place. The demography of American Jewry is radically different than it was 100 years ago or 50 years ago, and it is unpredictable at this point what it will be in 50 years' time. And of course, the same thing is happening in Israel. As you know, 30% or 35% or 40%, depending upon how you look at it, of the immigrants who have come from the former Soviet Union are not Jewish. They don't have it by by halachic reasoning, they're not Jewish. They don't have any particular Jewish beliefs. They don't have any particular Jewish family heritage. Many of them don't have Jewish mothers. Many of them are Christians, say that they're Christians, but they fall under the law of return. So that Israel is also, although I don't think it's happening in as radical a way, but Israel is also in the process of going from a group of ethnic Jewish tribes that all knew each other, even if they didn't know one another, but internally, to a society, a Western-style society, in which a significant proportion of the non-Arabs, that is to say what has been thought of as the Jews in Israel, are not Jewish. And once again, this is either bad or good depending upon your perspective. In my view, it's very good, although I do believe that we should cancel the law of return, because I think the law of return is a racist law. It posits that you have to have a quarter's Jewish blood in you to qualify, and it seems to me to be a piece of poetry whose time is now past in terms of its efficacy. Maybe after the war it made sense. Maybe during the state building period it makes sense. But at a time when it takes you 50 minutes to drive from Herzliya to Tel Aviv because of the traffic jams, Israel is not short on Jews. And Israel itself is a perpetual Jew-making machine now. There will always be plenty of Jews there, even, by the way, if there aren't any in Birmingham, Michigan. And this brings me to one of the last things I want to say. I grew up in a temple, I mentioned before, Temple Beth Jacob in Pontiac. Does anybody know what that temple is now? What is it? Daycare. Daycare. So, it's a church? A church and daycare. So, I think it's fair to say that on Elizabeth Lake Road, where once a vast Talmudic culture flourished, there is now nothing but a church and daycare. And of course, emotionally, when I think back on my childhood and my many experiences there and so forth, I'm sorry that it's not there. But in point of fact, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference if it's there or not. When I was a kid, I don't think there were any Jews in Birmingham. If they were, they sure weren't hanging out in temples. And, I mean, were there? In the 50s? Not too many. And nowadays, look at the flourishing Jewish community here. And in 50 years from now, there may not be any again. And so what? I went on the road with a guy named Macy Hart in Louisiana and Mississippi. There's synagogues in Mississippi and Louisiana that are closing up. You know, there used to be a bunch of Jews, and there'd be Jew stores in these small southern towns, what they call Jew stores, hardware stores and stuff, clothing stores. And they would get together and they'd have little synagogues, Reformed synagogues, usually German ones. And their children left, and now there's these towns where there are 2 people left or 3 people left. They're in their 70s, their 80s. They don't know what to do. They've got a building, they've got a Sefer Torah, they've got a cemetery to tend to, and there's nobody left. And Macy, who is a great guy, and has a camp in Utica, Mississippi, a Jewish camp, is picking up all these artifacts and so on and moving them to this camp. And he's arranging perpetual care for the cemeteries, and that's the end of it. He's burying the Jewish communities of Dixie, the Dixie diaspora. And it's sad work. I went with him, and it's sad work. When you see someone, an old man who's been driving around for 5 years with a Sefer Torah in the back of it, in the trunk of his car because he doesn't know where to put it, it's a sad thing. And on the other hand, so what? There were Jews in Toledo, there were Jews in Babylon, there were Jews all over the place. There were Jews every place, and they were there, and they're not there, and that's how it is. As I said before, Israel is a perpetual Jew-making machine. We will make enough Jews every night to fill the world with Jews for the foreseeable future. And you do not have to worry about survival. Take survival off your agenda. Jews are expert survivors. 3,500 years, they have not done many things that Jews have not done, but they've always survived. They're expert survivors. They will survive in America, and you don't have the personal responsibility for making them survive. They'll survive with or without each and every one of you and all of us together. Here in the United States, in Israel, in Russia, there used to be, 10 years ago, there were 2 million Jews. 1 million Jews came, now there's 2 million Jews. And so what do I want to end by saying? I want to end by saying this, that as I say, if there's going to be a Jewish identity in the United States, it's not going to be an identity via Yiddish, it's not Leo Rostin, it's not Fiddler on the Roof, it's not going to be the Lubavitcher Rebbe except for a few lunatics, it's not going to be your Bubby and her Bubby were in the same town in Russia. That's over with. It's also not going to be let's all go and help Israel, and it's also not going to be let's build another Holocaust museum. It's going to be whatever it is. Whatever it is. It's going to be whatever you want it to be. And the Jews are going to be whoever they are. It's going to be a big tent. It's like saying, what is Presbyterian identity? It's the sum total of the people who join the Presbyterian Church and believe in those things which are being preached in the variety of Presbyterian churches around the world. And if one of the things at any given time that's being preached is a sense of Klal Yisrael, then that will be something that you believe in. And if it's not, it won't. As far as Israel is concerned, and I do want to end with this because I've been talking for long enough. I see all. Good. It's good to have agreement in an audience. As far as Israel is concerned, I had an idea. I wasn't the only one with this idea, but I wrote some articles about it, and I was interviewed about it a bit. And that is that I think that the best thing to do is to separate between us, separation between us and the Orthodox. That is to say, 2 states. And no, I think that a couple other people. I mean, it's an idea that's been around. It's not an original idea of mine, but when you look at it, it actually happens to make some sense. Why? Number one, Israel, despite all the Zionist propaganda, is not such a little state. In fact, it's about halfway. If you take the 150-some states in the UN and you look in the almanac and you see population and you see size, Israel's right around in the middle. It's not one of the little, it's not, people say it's as small as New Jersey. Well, that's not bad. New Jersey's a pretty good-sized place. There's adequate room. And if you were to separate out what the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox actually care about, it really amounts to basically to Jerusalem and for the ultra-nationalist Orthodox parts of the West Bank. And everything else they don't really care about too much because the ultra-Orthodox don't work. And so, they don't work. I'm not being critical. I'm just saying that the unemployment is one of the great tenets of modern ultra-Orthodoxy. And so it seems to me that we could carve out, we can do one of two things. We can fight, and Mrs. Aloni is one of the, she's the Muhammad Ali of this fight. And she may enjoy fighting, and there are guys who love to fight with her. She's actually very popular with the ultra-Orthodox. They like to fight with her, and she knows all this stuff. She's very learned herself, and so they fight back and forth with psukim and everything. And we can really drive each other crazy. And we can reach a level of hatred, of mutual hatred, which I think we're very close to now, which is something like Bosnia. We can say, we can hate each other that much. We can hate each other so much that somebody murders a prime minister because he thinks that a rabbi wants him to. We can hate each other so much that somebody goes into a mosque and shoots 29 people while they're praying. We can hate each other so much that if you walk, that a TV guy I know who walked down the street dressed as an ultra-Orthodox guy in Jerusalem with a hidden microphone was cursed for 8 straight hours by everybody who passed him on the street. It's unbelievable how much hatred there is. And we can drive each other nuts with legislation and with fights and coming here to America and raising funds and all the rest of these things. We can do that. But we don't have to do it, because the truth of the matter is that in terms of Jewish identity, whatever else is true, we and the ultra-Orthodox are not part of the same people. We're two different peoples. For a golden moment, we were all put into the same concentration camp under the same rubrics of being Jewish. But that happened to be Hitler's idea. It wasn't ours. And in any event, history since then has created a moment in which there are two peoples living in Israel, also in the United States, but here you don't have to live, one next to the other, but certainly in Israel, forced to live together, each claiming to be Jewish, and really each having nothing to do anymore with the other group. We don't know one another, we don't marry one another, we don't work together, we don't live together, we don't socialize together, we don't share the same ideals, we don't have the same patriotism, and we don't have the same notion of what ought to be. They want a theocracy, and we want a modern secular democracy. It's just as simple as that. And there is no, in my view, and maybe I've missed something, I don't think that there is any conceivable compromise between ultra-Orthodoxy, political ultra-Orthodoxy, and modern secular democracy. I don't think that there's any compromise whatsoever. It can work in a place like New York, where they're a voting bloc and not more. But it can't work in a place like Israel, where they are an active part of politics, political life. And so it seems to me that rather than driving each other crazy, the simplest thing to do is to give them Jerusalem, which less and less of us care about now anyway, because it's so identified in the minds of Israelis with ultra-Orthodoxy. Let them turn it into a kind of a Vatican/Singapore. They can subsist on tourism and on Jewish instruction and on, and on schnorring, which are their main things. And if they want to work, they can work. And they will have their own judges who will be rabbis, self-appointed or appointed rabbis, and they will judge according to Jewish law. And anyone can live there, providing that they want to live under that regime. And the rest of us will have a country in the rest of the land of Israel, that is to say in the Galilee and in the Negev and along the coast. And this will be a Hebrew-speaking democracy which belongs to the people who live there. And the basic difference is that the ultra-Orthodox will be able to live their lives, except that they can't put their hands in our pockets for funds, and they can't ask us to defend their, physically, militarily, to defend their agenda. If they want Hebron, they can send their kids to Hebron. And if they don't want Hebron, they will, and they won't, they'll come to a very quick agreement with the Arabs, as they have always been able to come to agreements with whichever neighbors they've lived with. And we can have a Benelux arrangement and go back and forth. And in our territory, anyone Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox will be very free to live in our country, as long as their religion stays indoors. As long as Judaism remains an indoor activity. And then everyone can do as they like, but it will be a secular democracy in which there is a clear separation. Now, when I wrote this series of articles, I got a lot of letters from a lot of letters, and And they all really sort of said one of two things. Either they said, if I get my hands on you. No. What they really said was, okay, but what if that happens, what differentiates Israel from any other state? What makes it a Jewish state? What makes it different than France or Spain or Canada? And that's what the thought that I want to conclude with, and it's a related thought to the one that I had regarding American Jewry. And the answer is, that's our aspiration. That's what we aspire to. The ultimate ideology for us is a freedom from ideology and architectural planning, human architectural planning. The ultra-Orthodox rabbis, or even the Orthodox ones, have a divine plan. They know what Jews are supposed to be like, they know what Jews are supposed to look like, and what they're supposed to wear, and when they're supposed to get up, and what they're supposed to say when they get up, and they know everything. And the old socialists, the kibbutznikim and the socialist ideologues, although they were far more benign than the ultra-Orthodox rabbis, also had a plan for Jews. They knew where Jews were supposed to live, and they knew what they were supposed to speak, and they knew how you should dress, and they knew how many balatot a girl should be able to stretch her legs with her skirt so it wasn't too daring in the Girl Scouts. They knew everything. They had inch by inch. The entire thing was plotted out, how Jews were supposed to be. And you know what? In America, my Bubby also had a plan. She knew you marry a Jewish girl, you go to law school. Everybody's got a plan for the Jews. But the challenge that we face going into the 21st century is to live Jewish lives without a blueprint. To live Jewish lives without a master plan. To let Jewish lives and identity be the sum total of those people who call themselves Jews in any given generation or any particular moment, the sum total of the things that they're doing and thinking, the way that they're talking, the way that they're praying, the territories that they're inhabiting, and the politics that they're practicing. This is what Jewish identity is going to become when it is liberated from external identities and ideologies which are no longer relevant to it. And Israel, in this vision, which is my vision and my hope, will be a country which will be in a particular geography which is evocative of Jewish history, and it will have a majority for the time being of people who consider themselves Jews, although if that changes, it's fine. Its people will speak a Hebrew language, a Jewish language, which is Hebrew, and what they say in that language and what they produce in that language and what they do and produce in that territory will be entirely and completely up to them. The Arabs, the Russians, and the Sabras and the Wasps and the non-Israeli Jews and everybody else who lives there. And what will be is just what we are. We'll find out what Jews are like when Jews are off the plantation. We're off the plantation. We're out of the control of rabbis here. We're out of the control of rabbis and paternalistic planners there. And for that reason, if you've got the stomach for it, or as Jesse Ventura said, you've got a hard enough mind to wrap it around this concept, it's going to be, I think, the most interesting Jewish century, because it's going to be the one that we do for ourselves. Thank you very much.